So the role of intelligence and the demise of the agreed frameworks, and now we're coming into the second North Korean nuclear crisis. 2001, the new Bush administration came into office, and they were divided about how to proceed on the North Korean issue. After a considerable amount of debate in mid-2002, they had settled on what they called the bold approach, which was basically an effort to sort of expand the scope of discussions with North Korea. But at about the same time, in mid-2002, before there was a chance to re-engage with North Korean representatives, there were new intelligence reports that Pyongyang was procuring centrifuge materials in large quantities, significant quantities, and the estimate reportedly was that this meant these materials were sufficient that by the middle of the decade, the North Koreans could have a highly enriched uranium production plant sufficient to produce material for 2 to 4, I believe it was, nuclear weapons per year. And so the concern is the plutonium route is frozen, but the North Koreans appear to be developing facilities to develop fissile material for nuclear weapons using this other route, highly enriched uranium. So the skeptic faction in the Bush administration basically used this information to change the guidance of the US representative, Jim Kelly, who was going to go to Pyongyang to introduce discussions of this bold approach. Instead, he was given instructions that were rather narrow and restrictive. He was basically told, we want you to confront the North Koreans about this HEU program. We want you to tell them that they have to dismantle it before we have any more discussions. It's a precondition to further talks. After initially denying it on the second day of discussions, much to the surprise of the US delegation, the North Koreans ambiguously acknowledged or appeared to acknowledge that they had a HEU, highly enriched uranium program. They later denied that they had a program until 2009. So it took a couple more months for events to play out, but the US decided in November, as a result of the North Korean refusal to engage on this issue, that they would no longer provide heavy fuel oil shipments. Heavy fuel oil, as I mentioned, being the compensation for the freeze. So when this was announced, the North Koreans noted, hey, you know, that's a violation of an explicit provision in the agreed framework. If you do that, we're going to declare the agreed framework null and void. And once that heavy fuel oil shipment did end, the North Koreans very quickly expelled IAEA inspectors, removed all the IAEA seals from the reactor, restarted began reprocessing that spent fuel, completed their withdrawal from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. The 1 day left, they took that 1 day and withdrew. All that in a very short period of time, very quickly. I think they escalated it much more quickly than anybody had really anticipated. And in March 2003, in private discussions, the North Koreans told the US that the spent fuel would be converted for use in a nuclear deterrent. This is the first time they abandoned the fig leaf that the program was solely for peaceful purposes, but they chose that moment to do so. Of course, March 2003 was also the moment that the US was poised to invade Iraq. And in this exchange, they basically told us that we're not going to be like Iraq. We don't want you to invade us, and we're going to make sure we have a nuclear deterrent so you do not invade us. So I think it's fair to say that the skeptics in the Bush administration used the HEU issue to win the debate internally, and as John Bolton famously says in his memoirs, the HEU program was the hammer he was looking for to smash the agreed framework. There was a lot of people that did not like the agreed framework and were eager to kill it. But I think it's also important to note that the agreed framework was in trouble, arguably from day one. It was likely doomed in any case. There was a lot of thinking that, you know, the North Korean regime will collapse before we ever have to complete this, so let's not worry about these complicated things. But there were political problems in the U.S. from the beginning. As I mentioned, the agreed framework, because it puts aside the question of the historical accuracy of the North Koreans' initial declaration, it gives the impression of allowing a violation to go on without without addressing it. There were continued compliance concerns, the Kumchang-ri issue, the HEU issue, North Korean provocations, the 1998 Taepodong launch, the first time the North Koreans launched a missile that crossed over Japan, continued friction with the International Atomic Energy Agency, lack of progress on North-South issues. The provision of light water reactors, perhaps most important, faced insuperable obstacles. It's hard to see how that ever could have come to pass. There were protracted delays. The North Koreans were already complaining bitterly about the delays. There were always ongoing funding problems. Liability, perhaps the biggest issue. A big issue with nuclear reactors always is who is going to be responsible for liabilities in case there's an accident at this reactor. Because a nuclear accident at a power reactor can easily have enough liability issues to bankrupt the company that built it. So who's going to guarantee the reliability and the liability of a reactor in North Korea? It's not going to happen. And also, you know, the U.S. tended to think about this issue purely in terms of nonproliferation, where it's stopping or freezing the North Korean program. You know, the North Koreans saw this, as Bob Carlin always reminds us, in a much bigger framework. They saw this as a way to normalize relations with the United States. They basically wanted a get out of jail free card from the U.S. They wanted the U.S. not only to assure that we would not take any hostile action towards them, but we basically wanted them to validate the legitimacy of their government as a sovereign state. And that's a tall order for us, for a member of the axis of evil, to do something like that.